Hey guys, welcome back from spring break. Hope you had a relaxing week. We're just finishing up with chapter 14 as we come back this week. You were supposed to read section 3 of chapter 14 on the rest of the major disorders that were covered in the chapter. So we're going to get going and start reviewing that right now. So in terms of personality disorders, there's a few that are really highlighted in the chapter. Personality traits normally, as we had discussed before, are very flexible. Most people have a stable and consistent disposition that can be flexible in different experiences, and we do that because personality, as we know, can change throughout our lifetime, and depending on what trait it is. And it's due to experiences that we have and the wanting to be healthy and to act appropriately. What's different with personality disorders is those people with the disorders have a stable pattern of unwelcoming perceptions of themselves, others in the environment. And there's a lot of inflexibility and maladaptive behaviors across a wide range of situations. So unlike most of us that might change our behavior to act appropriately, this person does not matter what the range of situation it is, they would consistently have that maladaptive behavior. So these patterns do not fit with this, obviously, the social and the cultural norms. And many researchers believed that the disorders reflect actually the normal personality, but just in the extreme sense. People tend to blame others and don't see anything wrong with them, and so a lot of people don't get help. Histrionic personality disorder is like narcissism as well, in that. And what's interesting about them is they like who they've become and they don't want to have any change. So it's hard. To get them to come in because they don't think there's anything wrong with that. So it's hard to get any correct statistical data on some personality disorders because people, do not come in to get help. Okay, and so DSM-5 has identified 10 personality disorders, and I took that picture of table 14.7 in your book. And they've had to do a couple of things in order to have people be able to correctly be diagnosed. As we talked about, DSM-5 is the manual that's used to diagnose, and it has the parameters in which to do that, the time in which to do that, and we went over the 5Ds when it comes to disorders. So usually when people find this, they're going to find a personality disorder during adolescence or early adulthood. 10% of the population has some sort of personality disorder characteristics. And DSM first came up with the three basic clusters. As you can see, the odd eccentric cluster has the paranoid PD, schizoid PD, and schizotypal PD. And then the second cluster is dramatic, emotional, and erratic. So that has the antisocial and borderline, histrionic, and the narcissistic ones that I just mentioned. And then the last cluster is the anxious, fearful cluster. So the avoidance, personality disorder, dependent, and obsessive compulsive DP is under that. And it was really problematic because people could display one characteristic from one of the clusters, like an odd eccentric cluster, along with the dramatic, emotional, erratic cluster. And so they had to come up with a second set of classifications. So they said to look at, first of all, the severity scale, the degree in which the impairment's happening with that. And then also looked at the trait scale. We talked about the traits of personality ranging, and so they were looking at the tendency for someone to be like emotionally unstable on a certain range. Okay, so then antisocial personality disorder is one of the first disorders to look at, and this is where we really talk about the sociopath, psychopath, and sociopath. And we have our famous characters in history, a lot of them criminal in nature, that go along with antisocial personality disorder. But it's not always violence that's involved. There is, of course, in this disorder, but there can be people that do grow out, for lack of a better word, of the tendencies that they have in adolescence and adulthood. So this is a personality disorder that violates the rights of others without guilt and remorse. So that's where you get somebody who's a serial killer, some sort that is a psychopath or sociopath. And they have the ability to lie, cheat, and steal, and manipulate, and damage or harm people, and they don't have conscience of the guilt that they've done something to someone else, and there's a disregard for others that we see with this. So with that, some sociopaths or psychopaths can be highly successful, though. It takes a lot of, in some competitive professions, to be very ruthless. So they can fit into some very, prominent positions. It doesn't, there's no real true lack of being able to function sometimes with some people. And they are successful because they lack anxiety, so they can really thrive in a competitive environment where some people might crumble. Psychopaths also lack anxiety, so it's really easy for them to harm people. And what you might see around you in your own environment with kids at school that you're in lunch with, or on a bus, or in class with, that you might see somebody that has an antisocial personality disorder that isn't necessarily a psychopath, but has something, because we're seeing most of that come up in childhood or early adolescence, and it's often labeled as a conduct disorder. So if you look on the right there, prior to age 15, you might see a kid who's truant, so they're not going to school, they're expelled or delinquent, they're running away from home, lying a lot, early sexual promiscuity, early alcohol and substance abuse, because they're going against, societal rules and so forth, theft and vandalism, chronic misbehavior at home and at school, within in the community as well, and fighting. And then post 15, we see kids at your age, around your age, inconsistent employment or jobs, lack of parental responsibility, so that doesn't help to not perpetuate the behaviors. Also illegal behavior, so any of the ones that are on the right or the left could be there on the right. Unable to stay in any kind of romantic relationships, even friendships, very irritable, can't meet any financial obligations, very impulsive, reckless driving, maybe driving under the influence. So I know that we can kind of think of maybe somebody we've met or seen in school that's been like that, and they would be considered into this. So again, it's not just socio-psychopaths that are involved. It could be somebody that's dealing with this kind of thing as well. Some of the early things that you do see might lead, if somebody does not sort of grow out of this antisocial behavior, if they do have a criminal record, involve the police, they could have some cruelty to animals, attack others and things, setting fires and destroying property. If that continues and it's still something that person doesn't grow out of, then you might get somebody who might be somebody like a Ted Bundy or whichever, that they would not grow out of those tendencies. 4% of the population display characteristics, and more so in men than in women. So the definition that Jack Pement came up with in early on, so kind of an early or a more recent way of looking at sociopaths and psychopaths, is to kind of look at the true differences between them. So psychopaths, definitely one that lacks any kind of guilt or remorse, as we talked about before, pretending to feel emotions. So they might, cry or, laugh or be sad when it's acceptable for other people to, even though they don't feel that way. Inability to form emotional attachment, so that keeps them having that sense of, guilt of doing something bad against someone else. They tend to be very successful because they are manipulative. They're very dishonest, very narcissistic, and a superficial charm to them. So anybody that you've seen in any kind of movie that's sort of a psychopath that's very charming would be a psychopath. A sociopath lacks remorse as well, but guilt and empathy can be present in some cases. So that's very different. A psychopath has no remorse or empathy, absolutely none at all, where a sociopath would have a sense of morality that would be a little different, although it might be different than their community. And they commit deviant acts against social norms. So some emotions are felt, like rage, but they're shallow and there might be fleeting. They may form some close attachments to one or few individuals and then have disdain against others. Consistently irresponsible and violations of the law, constantly lying and deception, and very aggressive and reckless behavior. So, those sociopaths may show that deviant behavior outrightly, where a psychopath may be very manipulative and charming, and then, have those underlying behaviors that maybe are not like seen in public. Definitely not normal responses. I mean, a psychopath that wouldn't react very well to or any response to any disturbing images or if you pointed a weapon in their face. Okay, and so some characteristics of personality disorder. Then we'll get to Aaron Campbell here on the right and talk about his example. Definitely a failure to conform to social norms, deceiving and manipulating others for their own personal gain, speak very confidently and sincerely, and then respond with indifference or try to rationalize their decisions. Very contemptuous about the feelings and rights of others, and they blame others for their own stupidity. They lie and manipulate even their therapists. So a therapist can easily pick up on somebody who's a psychopath. They talk about maybe how, for instance, if it's a sexually deviant person that abuses young children or teenagers, they may talk about how when they're going to join society, they need to stay away from people because they don't want to harm them. But the fact that they're having no emotion while talking about it, a therapist can definitely pick up that the emotion is not there and they're not feeling what they're saying, and that somebody who's really remorseful about abusing a child would show more emotion, and they can tell that person's trying to be manipulative. They're very irresponsible. We talked about before, arrests in jail, high alcoholism and substance abuse rates. And again, some of those antisocial tendencies tend to diminish with some people, but others they don't. So Aaron Campbell is an example of somebody with antisocial personality disorder, or somebody that shows those characteristics of them. He's a 16-year-old, and he abducted the little girl that you see there, Alicia, from her grandparents' home. This was a case that happened a few years back. And she was raped and murdered by him, and he denied all of it, and then is serving 27 years in prison. And he did admit to it and say all he thought about was killing her. He could not get that off of his mind. And neighbors did talk about how he was known to harm animals and thought that he had buried their bodies somewhere. So you sort of see that sense of, of just contempt towards this cute, beautiful little child, and then having that background of having one of those components like harming animals. That can be an indication that something is going on with that child. Okay, so let's talk about borderline personality disorder. They say this is most serious. It's not that a psychopath is not serious, but this one in particular has a lot of things that can go with it in terms of the person themselves. So it's characterized by impulsive and chronic unstable emotions of relationships and self-image. So that person has extreme mood swings, uncontrollable episodes of anger and despair, and extreme, not just like, the normal kind of being upset at something. And fluctuating, going from one extreme to the other on a pendulum. They're very unstable relationships, so they see people in absolutes. So, for instance, they might idolize a lover or somebody that they've become intimate with, and then all of a sudden, in another moment, have complete contempt or hostility towards them. So, absolutely perfect to absolutely worthless. That's where that, ping pong from one side to the other. They have a chronic sense of emptiness and afraid of abandonment. And when you talk about chronic, it's chronic mood swings, chronic, emotion, and being upset, and not just, kind of normal things that might happen for a few days or a week, something that's chronic and over time. They definitely have a sense of identity as fragile, so they're always seeking reassurance and self definition from others because they can't create their own definition. And as you can see on the right, borderline personality disorder is also put in the same on DSM-5 of bipolar and related disorders. So they're put in the same category there. And as you can see, they've compared them there. And when we talk about it, it's kind of similar to the suicide rates, although personality disorder is a little bit less than bipolar. Um, Definitely, it's very pervasive, unwanted and abrupt, and has some significant history of trauma as a cause, which is with many of them. And so it's interesting kind of compare the two as you see them side by side. One person that had this in particular was Amy Weinblum, which was mentioned in your book, and she died of an overdose or alcohol poisoning. But she's not the only one. People like Angelina Jolie, Megan Fox, Lindsay Lohan, and Christy Ritchie have also talked about having borderline personality disorder. And there's some movies that sort of typify that. Winona Ryder's one called Girl Interrupted, and she's actually with Angelina Jolie in that movie. And there's a few others that also kind of look at that borderline personality disorder in their own way. What's really, concerning about borderline personality disorder is it can lead to self-destructive behavior. So if you see that person might do some cutting and self-mutilation. Amy Weinblum did it. She just felt like, the transfer of emotional pain to physical pain helped for her to get through a certain um, aspects of her trauma. And then threats of suicide for sure, and then suicide attempts in response to that abandonment, that sense of, so as we talked about before, the abandonment and feeling of being isolated and alone. If they are rejected or abandoned, then there's a possibility that those suicide attempts would rise. As many as 10% of those diagnosed with BPD eventually commit suicide. That's very high. I mean, 50 times higher than the rate of the general population. So they're really at risk for some really self-destructive behavior. They're also at risk for substance abuse, depression, eating disorders, and also impulsive behaviors such as gambling, reckless driving, or sexual promiscuity, and just sleeping around in order to make themselves feel whole. So there's a lot, they're at risk. And we talked about how mental illnesses are not just one and done. There's usually some transfer of something else going on. So if a person had one disorder, they probably have characteristics of another. One thing that was interesting to look at is borderline personality disorder is the yes and the no. And sort of that idea of getting rid of that stigma. I mean, yes, it's one of the more serious disorders, but as we look at it, I have personality disorders, but I'm not dangerous. And then secondly, I can be impulsive. That doesn't mean I'm violent. I'm on meds. That doesn't change who I am as a person. So really like looking at like all the things that can go along with personality disorder. People can function, as soon as they get help and meds, and can function really well, even with this kind of disorders we see with some of those people I listed. Some therapists don't like us. We aren't untreatable. You may know someone with borderline personality disorder. That doesn't mean you know me. So that's really important because with personality disorder and with many of the other ones we talked about, such individual variability with each one and how it affects each person. Friendships and relationships can be tough. That doesn't mean they're impossible. So really looking at, yes, there's lots of, negatives. We talk a lot about the negatives and symptoms of each one, but even somebody with it would beg to differ that it's, just something that's impossible to live with. So most commonly diagnosed is the personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. 6% of the population are affected, and it's more prevalent in women, people in a lower socioeconomic groups, and Native American men. And the lowest rates in women were of Asian descent. And that's interesting to look at that in terms of, why is it that borderline personality disorder is affected in those groups in particular, one being Native American men. And as we look at that, there is also a lot of high risk of alcoholism in those groups as well. And with lower socioeconomic groups, and then women, we talked about women being more prevalent with mental illnesses because of pressures put on them, being caregivers, and also then establishing themselves in the stress that can come with that in a society. And so stress going along with socioeconomic groups, and then Native American men, trying to provide for their families, and they struggle because of some factors that are outside of their own control. And so that can also look at the reason for that borderline personality disorder being higher in those groups. Causes of BPD, definitely disruption in attachment and relationships. Something is going on that was a trauma from early childhood, some kind of dysfunctional family relationships, or definitely neglect or physical, sexual, or emotional abuse in childhood. We see that sort of like as consistent, environmental factors being pretty large with some of them. What I thought was interesting is picture of regular thinking versus borderline thinking. So regular thinking, we have different shades and colors of the way that we characterize thinking, but with borderline thinking, it's all or nothing, good or bad, it's black or white. So it's very hard for those kind of people to see the variations. It's one or the other. And then also it could be that they're on one side, they're on the white side where it's good one day and really bad another day. And so they're in those extremes. Okay, and then causes also include a theory called the biosocial developmental theory. It's very similar to what we talked about with the biosocial psycho theory as well. Biological, psychological, and environmental factors can be a reason for BPD, and that was by Linehan, who did some studies on it. And she looked at how we are, first of all, born with certain temperaments. So you could be extremely emotionally sensitive or impulsive, or really focus on negative emotions just because that's the way you were born. So these biological factors then make us more vulnerable, and those people then could have caregivers that shape and reinforce patterns of maladaptive behavior. So, for one thing, we talked about punishment and so forth with children. But ignoring emotional outbursts, you'll see some people do that. If a child is doing it over and over again, you don't want to ignore major emotional outbursts. They need to know that those kinds of behaviors are not acceptable, and so forth, and that they can show emotions, but there's different ways of doing that. So if a caregiver is ignoring that, it's actually, actually condoning it and not doing anything to recorrect it. So that's the one thing I would say that people could do to create an environment that wouldn't allow for that vulnerability to come out because of biological factors. Okay, so let's move on to dissociative disorders. One in DID is one of the more interesting ones that I love to look at. So with this particular thing, normal people have awareness, memory, and their personal identity. And what's really interesting is, we all have experiences where we break from awareness. If we get so caught up in a book, or when we're driving and we've driven for a mile and then we don't really remember going through lights or passing or, driving at all, we sort of have that break in awareness or memory. And so just imagine that on a larger scale with somebody who has something like DID. And so that dissociative experience is a person's awareness, memory, and personal identity becomes separate or divided. So a disorder would be like a more extreme or frequent, something that would disrupt functioning. So if the person lost awareness for 2 hours and they're at work, so it would really have an effect on their functioning. The awareness being completely obstructed, like people do not remember at all, and they feel like they have memory loss. And so forth. So they can become very confused and sort of fragmented in their day. So there's two basic disorders. You have dissociative amnesia with fugu, and then you have what used to be called multiple personality disorder, which has now been renamed in DSM-5 as dissociative identity disorder. That's really important. It used to be called multiple personality disorder, but they want everyone to refer to it now as dissociative identity disorder. So we'll talk about dissociative amnesia that can include fugue, or and then go into DID after that. So with dissociative amnesia, it could be partial or total inability to recall important information. That's not because of a medical condition. And it's really personal events rather than any general knowledge. So people would remember, the president and so forth, but they may not remember like what they ate for lunch. So, and this is definitely in response to stress, trauma, or any extreme distressing situation. So, again, we may have some biological effects that make people vulnerable to something like this, but there could be some kind of major event that happens with that person, and then that's the response, which is why sometimes people fully recover because if the stressful situation, that trauma goes away and they deal with it, then that could go back and never happen again. So that's important to look at sort of the effects of stress and trauma. It could be some sort of combat, so somebody doesn't get PTSD, or maybe they have PTSD and they also have dissociative amnesia. Any kind of like divorce or serious problems, any kind of physical or emotional or sexual abuse could also cause it as well. Okay, so some dissociative amnesia have this condition, dissociative fugue. And fugue is when a person is in a state where they wander and they could even become a whole new identity. An example of a person that has been in several instances of a fugue state is Hannah Up. She is a teacher, and she has made the news quite a few times because she has disappeared quite a few times. So she first made the news in 2008 when she disappeared in New York City, and then she was discovered 20 days later when a ferryman floating face down the water surrounding by a Staten Island ferryman floating face down in the water surrounding the Statue of Liberty. And she didn't die, but she was found 20 days later after that in a completely different spot where she was. In 2012, she was living in Maryland and vanished again at the beginning of the school year, and then she turned up in a residence. Somebody found her 2 days later near a creek. And it seemed to be that she was always constantly being around water. And so she had no replication of what happened each time. You can see her, she's, quite lively and likes to go out and do adventurous things and so forth. But she has these episodes where she literally disappears and she wanders around and she does not return home because she doesn't remember. She's not aware and she's not in a state of awareness. Okay. So they're not sure why fugue states actually develop and not, some other, why doesn't Hannah create a symptom like anxiety and depression? They're just not really sure. And again, that has to do with a lot with, the variability with people and also, what we know about the brain and the body itself. But it's pretty scary when you think about that. The last time she disappeared, it was during a hurricane in 2017 when she had moved to St. Thomas. And she disappeared during that hurricane, and they did find her, but she had wandered off from where she was regularly supposed to be. So it can be kind of scary, especially in a situation like that. Okay, and then dissociative identity disorder, DID, that you can pronounce it as. This is where you have your multiple personalities, and this is like the one that everybody wants to talk about, right? So this one is extensive memory disruption for personal information. So not that general information, but personal, like what you've been doing or where you've been. It's also the presence of two or more distinct identities or personalities called alters within a single person. So each of those personalities or alters has a name and they have their own experience and their own personal history and self-image. And they're not aware to the primary personality. I would say this varies per person because the person that I've met with 100 personalities, they were aware that other people were talking for them, but they did not have conversations with the other alters like the other alters did. And so there's a wide range of ages and genders. That's what I experienced when I met this young lady. And she had very young alters and she had some males and females and so forth. And they're part of a system of a mind. I would say that I would agree with that as in my experience with it as well. The alters reflect a different aspect of an individual's personality. that isn't able to be integrated into the primary. So that person is so incredibly fearful and abused, for instance, and they have a personality where they can be strong and and lash out at people and defend themselves, but they're not able to have that integrated because they are so suppressed by maybe their abuse or whatever had gone on to put them in that state. So that part of their personality splits off and then becomes another alter ego to help protect the primary personality. So alters may have knowledge of each other and share memories with each other. I know the alters that were with the girl that I spoke with, they did talk to each other, not all of them, but some of them did. The ones that talked for her, they would speak the most, and they would decide who was going to speak first, second, last, that kind of thing. So it's really interesting because there's a misconception too about DID. And you guys are going to, one of the things you're going to do on Canvas is look at the movie Split and just the trailer for it and so forth. But most people who have DID will say they're really boring, and that a lot of them, there's a misconception of the interesting part of it. Most people are very normal and so forth. Most people are not out killing people like in Split. So you're going to be kind of looking at, sort of the media and its influence there. So what people will often experience, like Herschel Walker, was memory problems. That was the first thing, like losing time, not being able to recall something, and somebody, saying you were there, and you're like, I was definitely not there. And so there's also some psychiatric and physical problems. So they may also have depressive disorder, anxiety, PTSD, some substance abuse, sleep disorders because they're unable to sleep. Self-destructive behavior like cutting and things like that could happen as well. And definitely chaotic personal history. Something happened in the past that has created this kind of trauma for them to want to split off. So one of the things you're going to look at is you're going to watch a little clip on Herschel Walker, who is a famous football player who had amnesia from DID, and he didn't realize he had DID for many years. And his teammates would often characterize him as being very dynamic. He would do different things, so bobsledding to ballet dancing. And I do remember him ballet dancing, and we were always confused as to where that was coming from somebody who's such a savage football player, and seemed very kind of out of his personality. Sort of it didn't fit. And so, but that's because he had this, split disorder, like that was creating these different people. And so they were doing different things. He often referred to himself in the third person. So, Herschel played a good game today because it was another alter out at the time dealing with him playing football. So after retirement, he had a lot of violent outbursts and blackouts and memory loss, and that's when he really, because of the trauma of stopping playing football, he needed to figure out what was going on, and he was diagnosed, and it really made sense to him. But his alters, he had an alter called the Warrior, who handled playing football, and then the Hero, who would make public appearances and actually speak on camera as one of his alters as well. So there's a lot of skepticism, and criticism about DID. And people like Dr. Dalton, who came in to speak with us, will talk about how it's very hard to find somebody with DID. And I'd probably say that's true. I was very fortunate to have somebody who I was able to meet, but I've never met anybody besides that person, and that was 25 years ago or so. And Dr. Dalton's, like, as he said, is in a situation where he is with people all the time and barely finds anybody with DID. So it is very rare, and it's very rare, like you said, to find somebody where you can watch them switch from one alter to another. So cases, definitely, the reason why there is criticism, cases increased in the 1970s after it became very popular in films and books and dramas, and so even the number of alters dramatically increased. And DID patients probably learned how to behave a little bit, like in multiples from media, and then sort of being sort of trained to be, have multiples as well. So it's extremely rare for health officials to have a case today. So I can see where that criticism would come from, but it doesn't mean that somebody does not have it or can't possibly have it. So with DID causes, they talked about the dissociative coping theory, which I just talked about, like an extreme form of coping because of physical or sexual abuse. And 90% of people surveyed said that was the reason why they felt that they had developed this disorder or had surveyed that was part of their background that they had checked, that therapists had checked and found out that that was true. And they create an alter to deal with the trauma, the memories, and the emotions. And they want to dissociate from the emotions because it's too powerful for a child to integrate things like fear, and their level of fear and rage and anger into their own personality. So they want somebody else to deal with it. And so the lady I met, she was physically abused by her family. Her dad and her mother were the leaders of a cult in Pennsylvania. And in this cult, they did abuse children. They put them in cages. They deprived them of food and water at times. They had multiple people that sexually abused them, physically, emotionally abused them. So that level of abuse is what created that fear. And it was so powerful that she created those 100 personalities that she apparently had. And you can read a lot of quotes, and there's tons out there of like people describing what it's like. I like this one. I don't think I've ever been able to admit I had DID to my parents. I don't have the heart to tell my mother that my worst alters are because of her, which I thought was interesting that they were like, I don't want to make my mom feel bad for what she had created in me. And you can just see how people just really struggle with it. So it's very difficult in testing. DID is usually, like in Herschel's case, diagnosed in adulthood. And so some of those childhood memories are unreliable, which comes with why people are so skeptical about it. Was the abuse real or imaginary? Was it, something that didn't actually happen because of their mental illness? And traumatic memory, the way that we had talked about it before, it's kind of opposite. So you don't, in DID, you forget about that. The person forgets about the abuse because that's how they're disassociating from it. And it's not even repressive, it's just not being dealt with. But 80% of young adults with a history of sexual abuse remember the abuse. And so they have reoccurring and intrusive memories that they can't get rid of, like PTSD. And so it's sort of hard to think about not being critical of it because of the way that normally sexual abuse and physical abuse is seen. It wouldn't be something that would be forgotten or have a memory loss because of it. Okay, so let's move on to the last one, which is schizophrenia. And so schizophrenia is a split personality or shattered because they are losing their grip on reality. So unlike DID, where they create alters to protect, in schizophrenia, the person is literally believes they have become another person, that there's these hallucinations and realities, alternate realities that are existing, that they're within, and that's changed sort of their dynamic in their life. And it's very debilitating at that point. There's positive and negative symptoms. So positive are going to be the excess or distortion of normal function, and then negative will be the absence of something that's normal. So with the addition of something that's added with positive symptoms is delusions or false beliefs, hallucinations, severe disorganization of thought processes and speech is added, and severe disorganized behavior is added. The absence, the things that are reduced that should be normal, are the motivation, even expressive speech to become very monotone, apathy, and that apathy shows how that person is really isolated and disconnected, and they're non-communicative because their speech has been reduced and flattened. And not everyone experiences negative symptoms. You see more of the delusions and the hearing the voices and things like that in schizophrenia, but so it doesn't have to have both. So with schizophrenia, DSM-5 diagnosed 2 or more of the characteristics are active and have to be present for a month or longer in order to be diagnosed. And you need at least one symptom must be delusion, hallucination, or disorganized speech of some sort. So speech that doesn't make sense. It's kind of they're rambling and they're moving from one topic to another. And it usually involves a longer period of history, 6 months or more of odd behavior, beliefs, so the present for a month or longer, people don't usually go in for that, especially if people think they're under just stress. So 6 months or more of odd behavior. And then another symptom is catatonia or being catatonic, and that's what you see that lady in the right-hand side doing. So these are some highly disturbed movements or actions. And so this one is a bizarre posture and maybe a rigid pose to resist being moved. It creates immobility, no speaking or very little speech, can get extremely agitated. They might echo or copy the words spoken just by another or imitate movements, and they're definitely trying to resist the directions of others. So this is a real clear sign of somebody that's schizophrenic. Somebody has these odd postures. So positive symptoms such as delusions. So this is what we normally see with people that are schizophrenic, a false belief that persists despite the fact that they may come across some compelling evidence, bizarre and far-fetched beliefs that they become preoccupied with, such as being abducted by aliens. It can lead to some really dangerous behavior if they feel like, for instance, a person, their neighbor, is the alien that abducted them. They might end up attacking them if that person just tries to come and talk with them. They think people are after them, so forth, so they can become dangerous or, so forth if that is the case. So there's a couple of things that are in terms of delusions. Delusions of reference are convictions that other people and ordinary events are somehow personally related to them. So they'll see an ad or a billboard or something out and they'll feel that there's a cryptid message in there, and they find that with everything, an advertisement, on the television, something put in their mailbox that everybody got in the neighborhood, but they feel it's personally put to them. Delusions of grandeur is that person is extremely powerful, important, or wealthy. So, for instance, they may believe that Russian spies are after them because they have the knowledge of something that the Russian spies want. So they're important, and that's where this sort of paranoia is coming from. And then delusions of control, outside forces like aliens, government, or random people are trying to control them. And it creates some big agitation and anxiety for them. And then positive symptoms also include hallucinations. So false or distorted perceptions. This is where you have usual voices or so auditory and also visual stimuli that seem real. For most people, they are at 63% are getting the auditory. So most of them are getting this voices, whispering, those kinds of things. 27% will get visual, and then others might be tactical, like touch, and then smell and taste may also be illusions or hallucinations as well. And that content is tied to the person's delusional beliefs. So if they have a delusion of grandeur that they're, there as a prophet or something for God, they may hear directions from God. So that auditory is connected to their delusion of grandeur, that they're this important person that has an impact on the world, or some bizarre connection to the world, and they may hear God talk to them. And it's really impossible for them to distinguish between reality, and that's why they become so agitated. If it's less severe, the person might recognize the hallucination as a product of their own mind, and be able to try to control it. This girl that you see right here, she's a 17-year-old teenager, and what she decided to do with her hallucinations was to create art. And she's got several pieces that are kind of interesting where she uses it, and it's really cool to see, the art that she puts together, because this is how she's manifesting like what she's actually seeing. And she can only describe that. But here's a little, looks like a little bug, and it says, "Set it all on fire." So again, this hallucination might tell her to set things on fire, and she might actually do that. And then she's got some other pieces of things crawling out of walls, just some different characters that they almost look cartoonish, and so forth. It's kind of interesting that she's using her ability to draw and to show her hallucinations. So PET scans that were done on people with schizophrenia showed that auditory and visual areas of the brain were lighting up, but not that frontal lobe. So again, like we do in dreams, our auditory and visual associated areas are lit up, but then we don't have the frontal lobe that puts together that logical reasoning with those visual and auditory things. So you can see that that's very true with schizophrenics as also. Okay, another positive symptoms that they might experience are disturbances in sensation, thinking, and speech. So as you see, there's a delusion there of the person looking that they're very tall. They might believe that an object is flat, or their arm is only a few inches long or longer than it usually is, things like that. So they literally have some really weird visual sensations. Disorganized thinking, they're not able to concentrate, remember, integrate important information. Rather, they take all the irrelevant information, and their mind ping-pongs between different topics in unpredictable and illogical ways. So really nonsensical kind of images and words, and they'll talk about that. So that's why their speech seems very erratic. And then negative symptoms are, again, those things that diminish. So definitely emotional expression and their speech flattens. And regardless of the situation, the person responds in a very emotionally flat way. So, they're just affective, deficient. So they're lacking facial expressions. They lack interest in social situations. And they have communicative deficiencies or lacking in speech and in general, and lack of motivation. So it's definitely a dramatic reduction in those things. Their speech is very slow, it's very monotone, and lacks voice and inflection. Aloga is a greatly reduced production of speech. So even if it's not slow, it might become very brief and very empty comments, like not something that's really engaged in the social setting because they're really deficient and interested in that. Avolition is the inability to initiate or persist any kind of goal-directed behavior. So what you might see with negative symptoms of schizophrenics, they're not going to bathe, they might not dress, engage in social activities like they normally would. So they're just decreasing and diminishing things that they would normally do as functioning human beings. And then as you see from your book, about positive and negative symptoms, if someone was going to have positive symptoms, a lot of it's going to be delusions. Hallucinations are still pretty strong at 58%, and so forth. And then most of what they're going to have is apathy. Avolition is going to be 85%. Very few have alogia, like where they have that poverty of speech, and flat affect, being very apathetic is going to be seen at 65%. So in terms of symptoms and cultures, it's going to really vary. So in terms of delusions, that can be defined very differently. If somebody is in a delusional state, some religious sects, like that is a part of sort of how they function, and what's acceptable in some cultures isn't going to be acceptable in other ones. What they did find with a study that they did, an international study they did, was to look at 7 different countries. And if you look at them, there's 2 from Africa. Most of them are from Eastern Europe, which is just, I would have rather them done, some in America, South America, Asia, and really gotten, countries to really look at the study and vary that. But what did come out of it was that 16.8% of the content of the delusions was culturally specific. So in Nigeria and Ghana, because it's part of their culture, being an angel or a prophet, that delusions of grandeur was a high rate of their delusions. And so that went with their culture. And then content of the delusions can change with cultural shifts. So for instance, in World War II, delusions might have been about Nazi soldiers, for instance, but and you see that in one of the Welcome to Marwen with Steve Carell. was abused at a bar. He was beat up by men in a bar. And he often thinks that a Nazi soldier is trying to kill him in real life and has hallucinations about it. But more today is going to be things like technology. And we see the Truman Show delusion, where people think like they're being filmed on a reality show, which is what happened in the Truman Show movie. But now they call it a delusion because people really think that they're being secretly filmed on a reality show. So the prevalence of schizophrenia, there's 200,000 new cases diagnosed each year, and 1 million Americans are being treated. So 1% of the population experiencing at least one episode of this kind of some kind of characteristic of schizophrenia in their lifetime. And it is across cultures. However, the global rate is a lot larger than the US rate of 1%. It's 4%. So they think that it's a lot more widespread than they thought before. So the course of the disorder, it's usually found in young adulthood, and it definitely varies between individuals. 1/4 of who experience a episode recover completely and never experience it again. And then 1/4 who experience reoccurring episodes have only minimal impairment. The more alarming is that half of the total people become chronic and severe impairment and might need to repeat hospitalization and extend their treatment. So a large portion of people who do get the disorder are in the chronic stage. Cultural factors are interesting to look at. It's better, which is opposite of what we usually talk about, is there's a better outcome in developing world countries than developed world countries like our own. So the WHO did a study of the full recovery of patients, and that 3% of the U.S. in a developed world compared to 54 actually recovering fully in India, more of a developing world, was really interesting. That maybe there's some kind of more acceptance of mental illness and the use of extended family for support in those countries. So that's sort of the opposite of what we normally see. Usually developing world, there's a lot of implications more so than developed world in terms of positivity. So why does it develop? Well, it's very complex. There's lots of different components. So quickly going through those, one is genetics. So there's definitely clusters in different families. The more related you are to a person with a disorder, the greater the risk. If either biological parent of an adopted child has the disorder, it would increase their risk as well. And 50% risk rate if someone's identical twin also has the disorder. But also on the other side of that is, well, there's 50% who get the disorder that are not related to a twin or so forth. So why are they getting the disorder? And that's where we get to other ones. More with genetics, they've come up with the idea that there's certain genetic variations that seem to increase the risk of somebody being susceptible to it. And those are genetic mutations. And they develop more in people with schizophrenia, even with no family history. Those people develop more genetic mutations than other people. And they're not sure exactly why, but they just do. And the disorder is associated with thousands of gene variations, so there's no specific variation that they have found as a cause. They have, however, found a few things that are a little bit more pinpointy. DNA samples of schizophrenic and bipolar had similar genetic patterns, as well as having similar locations of chromosomes for brain development, memory, and cognition, and they were linked. And then a large number of gene variants were found to occur on specific chromosomes that are linked in the immune system. So just having different disorders have similar parts of brain DNA, alleles, chromosomes, all those things. They've sort of found some connections, but not any real cause. One other factor was older fathers and risks as well. Due to no family history, researchers started to look at the evidence of gene mutation. And so what they found was if as a male gets older, they have more divisions of their sperm cells, and more of those accumulate more genetic mutations that they can pass on to their child. So if you look at the graph there, as the person gets older and older, there's more incidences of having more rates per thousand in terms of passing around the risk to a child. And so Doris Malaspina, she did a study in Jerusalem and looked at 85 or 87,000 people and looked at who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then definitely found parental age was a strong predictor of someone having it. So, for instance, men 45 to 49 were twice as likely to have offspring with the disorder compared to those bearing children at 25 to and under. And then 3 times more likely were men 50 plus. And so a fourth of the cases attributed to the father's age. They've looked at autism too, as you look on the chart there to the side, that autism also with age, so those genetic mutations inherited from a parent can be not only for that, can be for other things as well. And they're looking at those genetics in order to see if there's anything to explain what's happening as a child is born. And then another reason that they looked at with schizophrenia is the immune system and a viral infection theory. So this is the idea that a woman who contracts the influenza or some other viral infection during the prenatal development, or if a baby gets it shortly after birth, that can spread to the brain and spinal cord and affect a brain development. Alan S. Brown did a study and compared stored blood samples of 64 mothers who later developed the disorder. And what the results was that women who had been exposed to the flu during the first trimester were 7 times more likely to have a child with schizophrenia. And what's going to be really interesting is, since we do have a respiratory illness that is here, is how many pregnant women got the coronavirus in the next year or so, or 2 years, depending. And then what kind of mental illness do we see out of children that women had? That would be interesting to see if that is not just influenza, but coronavirus would also be included in those viral infections. And of course, they found another study that found that schizophrenia occurs in people born in the winter and spring months, which also coincides with when respiratory infections are more common. And then abnormal brain structures, we talked a lot about this throughout the entire chapter. For schizophrenia in particular, they found the enlargement of ventricles. Those are the cavities, all the little indentations in the brain, and how there was an enlargement of those, but they weren't sure how this was really related, because ventricles don't seem to have any kind of like causation of any kind of behavior, but loss of gray matter does. And so loss of gray matter and lower volume of brain altogether. You can see that from the MRI scans of these 28-year-old males, identical twins, and showing the enlargement of brain ventricles in the twin with the schizophrenia on the right compared to his brother on the left. Even the loss of brain matter, you can see that between twins, they've done that as well. And then the gray matter, remember, is glial cells, neuron cells, and the unmyelinated axons, the covering over the axons, the unmyelinated axons of the cerebral cortex. So if you start to relate that to increased symptoms and decrease in cognitive function, that makes a lot more sense as well. Paul Thompson did a study where he studied the brain of 12 adolescents diagnosed with schizophrenia and their brain structure. So there's 6 males and 6 females, all experiencing symptoms before the age of 12. They began their MRI scans they did for 5 years at the age of 14, and they compared those with healthy teens, quote, those people that didn't have any schizophrenia characteristics or symptoms. And what they found there's definitely a difference in brain development. In that sense, of the brain development that's being affected and the reduction of gray matter is because of that the development that we talked about before, where the brain goes through pruning. And so what they found was that there is a certain amount of pruning that happens that's normal during that developmental stage. But for people that are healthy, it's 1%. For those that were patients that had schizophrenia, it was up to 5%. And there was some major loss. It wasn't gradual, but it was really severe. So the more gray matter that's lost, they also found that increased their clinical symptoms, because they were doing a longitudinal study and watching them over so many years. And they found that as the gray matter actually went down, and their brain volume went down, that definitely affected their clinical symptoms that had an inverse correlation. So with the temporal lobe being losing things first, then they got more positive symptoms like delusions, and then if they got frontal lobe loss, they had more negative symptoms like flat speech, and that makes sense because those are the places that would occur. The only thing is they don't know what sparks that rapid loss of the matter. You know, could it be a gene mutation? You know, what was it that created it? They just know that it did happen. Okay, and then conclusions that they did find about the brain is that not all people with schizophrenia have brain abnormalities. The evidence is very correlational, so not causation, so you have to be careful of that. And abnormalities are seen in other mental disorders. So is, you know, these a general contributor to mental disorders, the things about the brain, we don't know. Is it very specific to schizophrenia? They're still not sure. Okay, and then lastly, the abnormal brain chemistry, so imbalances in neurotransmitters. But they found that the oldest hypothesis is the one about dopamine, that there's excessive activity of dopamine, and that's supported by two things. Antipsychotic drugs, for instance, Haloid, Horazin, and the others reduce or block the dopamine. So they're an antagonist drug, and they reduce symptoms, and especially positive symptoms. So because the drugs are seeing a decrease in positive symptoms and so forth, they have to be blocking the dopamine, which means that dopamine is probably the thing that's increasing. Drugs that enhance dopamine activity in the brain, so things like cocaine, amphetamines, they can produce schizophrenic-like symptoms when taken, and also people who have schizophrenia, their symptoms actually increase. So those two things have shown that there's a connection with dopamine. The other things that they've looked at that contradicts the dopamine hypothesis is that not all individuals with schizophrenia who were on antipsychotic drugs could attribute their reduced in symptoms because of those drugs. Some had relief, but not all, and only positive, not negative symptoms were affected. Also, the limbic system, they felt like might have too much dopamine or other parts of the brain, like the cortex. And then you have other imbalances of other neurotransmitters that also could be not just dopamine. And then psychological factors, so any of your environmental, it's not one factor, but those genetic predispositions, epigenetics, as we've talked about before, you're genetically predisposed, but then you become more vulnerable because of things going on in your environment. So they definitely have connected dysfunctional families, disturbing family communication styles, and parenting styles as well. And as they looked at this, they had the, the Finnish adoptive family study of schizophrenia. And this is where they looked at 150 adopted individuals who had mothers with schizophrenia. So again, they'd have that biological predisposition to schizophrenia, and they compared that to 180 adopted kids with no biological predisposition. And so as a result of that, they definitely found that environment made a huge difference. Biologically predisposed kids who had mothers with schizophrenia had an increased rate, but it was only when they were raised in a psychologically disturbing home. And then children raised in a healthy family were no more likely than the 180 kids that had no biological predisposition to develop schizophrenia. So definitely they found that a healthy environment can counteract that genetic vulnerability of having a disorder, or an unhealthy family can be a catalyst for that disorder or other mental illnesses. So one of the things you're also going to look at is A Beautiful Mind and symptoms of schizophrenia and so forth. And it's going to go through that. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and that it's a good movie based on a true story. The other things that I want to go through before we finish this particular chapter is what some major things that are going on with DSM-5 and things that they've added. So just real briefly, and one of them you're actually going to do a video analysis of. So first of all, they looked at childhood disorders. That's one of the categories in DSM-5. And one new disorder that they've created is called global developmental delay. And so this is a new one that they've created that says that the child's not able to take an IQ test due to some cognitive, social, speech, or language delay. And they've created a disorder called global development delay that says, okay, there's just a global delay in any of the development of where a child should be. So that's one that was added on there. Also in the impulsive conduct disorders, we didn't get to talk about a couple that I think are really interesting. Pyromania, so lighting things on fire, and just that compulsive, they have to light things on fire. And then kleptomania is that stealing things, and being a kleptomaniac is a compulsive disorder as well. The other one I'm going to have you look at is hoarding, hoarding disorder, and there's a show on TV called Hoarders, and so this is not going to be Hoarders, but it's going to be somebody talking about how she helps people with hoarding. And so I want you to be looking at that and really thinking about how that woman talks about bringing down the stigma of somebody who's a hoarder, because media is doing the opposite and creating sort of this comical thing about hoarders and so forth. So I'm going to have you look at that. So that's under conduct disorder, impulsive conduct disorder. Under the bipolar and related disorders, they have one called separation anxiety disorder, and now that can be classified with adults. So separation from any comfortable situation, and they've created this situation because there's adults that are coming out with these separation anxiety, which typically is diagnosed with children, but they're now classifying it in this way with adults. Under depression, there is a new a disorder called premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and this is where they found an extreme form of PMS, premenstrual syndrome, and that's sort of the moodiness and things that normally come with women and girls that are going through PMS or their period each month. And so they have had to put a disorder because it's an extreme form of that, and it's being helped by the insurance companies if they can have it in DSM-5. So that's a new one they've included under depression. Trauma, under the category of trauma, they have created one called reactive attachment disorder. And there's not much research, but what they have found is it's starting in infancy. And it's the idea that idea of attachment that we've talked about in the previous chapter, of not bonding with a caregiver because of the quality of care is not there because of distress. So they've created this disorder because it's coming out, for instance, a caregiver, like a mother who has a drug issue, is not caring for her child. Foster children that are bounced from one caregiver to another and not really getting that bond, and a failure to thrive because of the disorder. And they've had to put a name onto it because it doesn't fit in any other place under trauma. So that one's an interesting one that's new. Asymptomatic symptom disorder. Included in this is illness anxiety conversion, which used to be pretty much called hypochondria. So they've renamed it illness anxiety conversion. There is somebody at the OCD Institute in Boston, a patient needs to wear bags on his hands at all times because he's a hypochondriac or has illness anxiety conversion. Another one that's interesting and the addictive disorders is they've now had tobacco use disorder and also substance abuse. It's an addition of a mental disorder now. If you have an addictive disorder, a substance abuse disorder, you can be labeled under DSM-5 now as having a mental disorder, which is kind of interesting and powerful because a substance abuse disorder is something that's been around for a while, but not been put in as a mental disorder. So it's under addictive disorders right now. Sleep and wake disorders are also included in there. Restless leg syndrome is actually a disorder. It is a sleep disorder, but it's labeled in DSM-5, and it's really controversial because they're not sure if it's a medical issue versus a mental disorder. So it's still pretty controversial that it's been placed in there. And then other ones, neurocognitive disorder, people that are older, so delirium and Alzheimer's is being labeled under those. And then one of the things that you'll see with schizophrenia, OCD, and related disorders as well is the idea of trichotillomania. And that is where somebody's going to pull their hair. So in one category, they've now streamlined the diagnosis, and they're treating it with antipsychotic drugs. So if it's in the same category, they can go ahead and do that. So schizophrenia, OCD, and related disorders Again, as we talked about before, hoarding is a part of that that compulsive disorder, but trichomania is as well. And exacerbation, which is scratching the skin. And you can see the picture there on the right. Somebody's picking, profusely picking the skin around their fingernails, so much that it bleeds, and they can't stop it from happening. And as you can see, that's a really interesting poster there, because it says, I am not on drugs, nor have I ever was. I have an impulsive control disorder, not a skin disorder. It's like OCD. I could stop. I could just stop. I would. I'm not contagious. And you can see they will literally, I didn't put a picture of this because it's pretty disturbing. They will pick, parts of their skin off. And that's what those scabs are on that picture of that, drawing of that girl, is that they're just picking skin off and they can't stop. And so again, that's a related disorder that they would treat with an antipsychotic drug, just like schizophrenia.